Catch-22 by Joseph Heller continued. He continued past a tent with a luminous pearl-gray cat sunning itself outside, and past another trailer on cinder blocks, and then burst into the clearing of Yossarian's squadron. A salty dew had formed on his lips. He did not pause, but strode directly across the clearing into the orderly room, where he was welcomed by a gaunt, stoop-shouldered staff sergeant with prominent cheekbones and long, very light blonde hair, who informed him graciously that he could go right in since Major was out. The chaplain thanked him with a curt nod and proceeded alone down the aisle between the desks and typewriters to the canvas partition in the rear. He bobbed through the triangular opening and found himself inside an empty office. The flap fell closed behind him. He was breathing hard and sweating profusely. The office remained empty. He thought he heard furtive whispering. 10 minutes passed. He looked about in stern displeasure, his jaws clamped together indomitably, and then turned suddenly to water as he remembered the staff sergeant's exact words. He could go right in since Major was out. The enlisted men were playing a practical joke. The chaplain shrank back from the wall in terror, bitter tears springing to his eyes. A pleading whimper escaped his trembling lips. Major was elsewhere, and the enlisted men in the other room had made him the butt of an inhuman prank. He could almost see them waiting on the other side of the canvas wall, bunched up expectantly like a pack of greedy, gloating, omnivorous beasts of prey, ready with their barbaric mirth and jeers to pounce on him brutally the moment he reappeared. He cursed himself for his gullibility and wished in panic for something like a mask or a pair of dark glasses and a false mustache to disguise him, or for a forceful, deep voice like Colonel Cathcart's, and broad, muscular shoulders and biceps to enable him to step outside fearlessly and vanquish his malevolent persecutors with an overbearing authority and self-confidence that would make them all quail and slink away cravenly in repentance. He lacked the courage to face them. The only other way out was the window. The coast was clear, and the chaplain jumped out of Major's office through the window, darted swiftly around the corner of the tent, and leaped down inside the railroad ditch to hide. He scooted away with his body doubled over and his face contorted intentionally into a nonchalant, sociable smile in case anyone chanced to see him. He abandoned the ditch for the forest the moment he saw someone coming toward him from the opposite direction, and ran through the cluttered forest frenziedly like someone pursued, his cheeks burning with disgrace. He heard loud, wild peals of derisive laughter crashing all about him, and caught blurred glimpses of wicked, beery faces smirking far back inside the bushes and high overhead in the foliage of the trees. Spasms of scorching pains stabbed through his lungs and slowed him to a crippled walk. He lunged and staggered onward until he could go no farther and collapsed all at once against a gnarled apple tree, banging his head hard against the trunk as he toppled forward and holding on with both arms to keep from falling. His breathing was a rasping, moaning din in his ears. Minutes passed like hours before he finally recognized himself as the source of the turbulent roar that was overwhelming him. The pains in his chest abated. Soon he felt strong enough to stand. He cocked his ears craftily. The forest was quiet. There was no demonic laughter. No one was chasing him. He was too tired and sad and dirty to feel relieved. He straightened his disheveled clothing with fingers that were numb and shaking, and walked the rest of the way to the clearing with rigid self-control. The chaplain brooded often about the danger of heart attack. Corporal Whitcomb's jeep was still parked in the clearing. The chaplain tiptoed stealthily around the back of Corporal Whitcomb's tent rather than pass the entrance and risk being seen and insulted by him. Heaving a grateful sigh, he slipped quickly inside his own tent and found Corporal Whitcomb ensconced on his cot, his knees propped up. Corporal Whitcomb's mud-caked shoes were on the chaplain's blanket, and he was eating one of the chaplain's candy bars as he thumbed with a sneering expression through one of the chaplain's Bibles. "Where have you been?" he demanded rudely and disinterestedly without looking up. The chaplain colored and turned away evasively. "I went for a walk through the woods." "All right," Corporal Whitcomb snapped. "Don't take me into your confidence, but just wait and see what happens to my morale." He bit into the chaplain's candy bar hungrily and continued with a full mouth. "You had a visitor while you were gone, Major." The chaplain spun around with surprise and cried, Major? Major was here?" "That's who we're talking about, isn't it? Where did he go?" He jumped down into that railroad ditch and took off like a frightened rabbit, Corporal Whitcomb snickered. What a jerk. Did he say what he wanted? He said he needed your help in a matter of great importance. The chaplain was astounded. Major said that? He didn't say that, Corporal Whitcomb corrected with withering precision. He wrote it down in a sealed personal letter he left on your desk. The chaplain glanced at the bridge table that served as his desk and saw only the abominable orange-red pear-shaped plum tomato he had obtained that same morning from Colonel Cathcart, still lying on its side where he had forgotten it like an indestructible and incarnadine symbol of his own ineptitude. Where is the letter? I threw it away as soon as I tore it open and read it. Corporal Whitcomb slammed the Bible shut and jumped up. What's the matter? Won't you take my word for it? He walked out. He walked right back in and almost collided with the chaplain, who was rushing out behind him on his way back to Major. You don't know how to delegate responsibility, Corporal Whitcomb informed him sullenly. That's another one of the things that's wrong with you. The chaplain nodded penitently and hurried past, unable to make himself take the time to apologize. He could feel the skillful hand of fate moving him imperatively. Twice that day already, he realized now, Major had come racing toward him inside the ditch, and twice that day the chaplain had stupidly postponed the destined meeting by bolting into the forest. He seethed with self-recrimination as he hastened back as rapidly as he could stride along the splintered, irregularly spaced railroad ties. Bits of grit and gravel inside his shoes and socks were grinding the tops of his toes raw. His pale, laboring face was screwed up unconsciously into a grimace of acute discomfort. The early August afternoon was growing hotter and more humid. It was almost a mile from his tent to Yossarian's squadron. The chaplain's summer-tan shirt was soaking with perspiration by the time he arrived there, and rushed breathlessly back inside the orderly room tent, where he was halted peremptorily by the same treacherous, soft-spoken staff sergeant with round eyeglasses and gaunt cheeks, who requested him to remain outside because Major was inside, and told him he would not be allowed inside until Major went out. The chaplain looked at him in an uncomprehending daze. Why did the sergeant hate him, he wondered. His lips were white and trembling. He was aching with thirst. What was the matter with people? Wasn't there tragedy enough? The sergeant put his hand out and held the chaplain steady. I'm sorry, sir, he said regretfully in a low, courteous, melancholy voice, but those are Major's orders. He never wants to see anyone. He wants to see me, the chaplain pleaded. He came to my tent to see me while I was here before. Major did that? The sergeant asked. Yes, he did. Please go in and ask him. I'm afraid I can't go in, sir. He never wants to see me either. Perhaps if you left a note. I don't want to leave a note. Doesn't he ever make an exception? Only in extreme circumstances. The last time he left his tent was to attend the funeral of one of the enlisted men. The last time he saw anyone in his office was a time he was forced to. A bombardier named Yossarian forced... Yossarian? The chaplain lit up with excitement at this new coincidence. Was this another miracle in the making? But that's exactly whom I want to speak to him about. Did they talk about the number of missions Yossarian has to fly? Yes, sir, that's exactly what they did talk about. Captain Yossarian had flown 51 missions, and he appealed to Major to ground him so that he wouldn't have to fly 4 more. Colonel Cathcart wanted only 55 missions then. And what did Major say? Major told them there was nothing he could do. The chaplain's face fell. Major said that? Yes, sir. In fact, he advised Yossarian to go see you for help. Are you certain you wouldn't like to leave a note, sir? I have a pencil and paper right here. The chaplain shook his head, chewing his clotted, dry lower lip forlornly, and walked out. It was still so early in the day, and so much had already happened. The air was cooler in the forest. His throat was parched and sore. He walked slowly and asked himself ruefully what new misfortune could possibly befall him a moment before the mad hermit in the woods leaped out at him without warning from behind a mulberry bush. The chaplain screamed at the top of his voice. The tall, cadaverous stranger fell back in fright at the chaplain's cry and shrieked, "Don't hurt me!" "Who are you?" the chaplain shouted. "Please don't hurt me," the man shouted back. "I'm the chaplain." "Then why do you want to hurt me?" "I don't want to hurt you," the chaplain insisted, with a rising hint of exasperation, even though he was still rooted to the spot. "Just tell me who you are and what you want from me." "I just want to find out if Chief White Half-Oat died of pneumonia yet," the man shouted back. "That's all I want. I live here. My name is Flume. I belong to the squadron, but I live here in the woods. You can ask anyone." The chaplain's composure began trickling back as he studied the queer, cringing figure intently. A pair of captain's bars, ulcerated with rust, hung on the man's ragged shirt collar. He had a hairy, tar-black mole on the underside of one nostril, and a heavy, rough mustache the color of poplar bark. "Why do you live in the woods if you belong to the squadron?" the chaplain inquired curiously. "I have to live in the woods," the captain replied crabbily, as though the chaplain ought to know. He straightened slowly, still watching the chaplain guardedly, although he towered above him by more than a full head. "Don't you hear everybody talking about me? Chief White Half-Oat swore he was going to cut my throat some night when I was asleep, and I don't dare lie down in the squadron while he's still alive." The chaplain listened to the implausible explanation distrustfully. "But that's incredible," he replied. "That would be premeditated murder. Why didn't you report the incident to Major Major?" "I did report the incident to Major Major," said the captain sadly, "and Major Major said he would cut my throat if I ever spoke to him again." The man studied the chaplain fearfully. "Are you going to cut my throat, too?" "Oh, no, no, no," the chaplain assured him. "Of course not. Do you really live in the forest?" The captain nodded, and the chaplain gazed at his porous gray pallor of fatigue and malnutrition with a mixture of pity and esteem. The man's body was a bony shell inside rumpled clothing that hung on him like a disorderly collection of sacks. Wisps of dried grass were glued all over him. He needed a haircut badly. There were great dark circles under his eyes. The chaplain was moved almost to tears by the harassed, bedraggled picture the captain presented, and he filled with deference and compassion at the thought of the many severe rigors the poor man had to endure daily. In a voice hushed with humility, he said, "Who does your laundry?" The captain pursed his lips in a businesslike manner. "I have it done by a washerwoman in one of the farmhouses down the road. I keep my things in my trailer and sneak inside once or twice a day for a clean handkerchief or a change of underwear." "What will you do when winter comes?" "Oh, I expect to be back in the squadron by then," the captain answered with a kind of martyred confidence. "Chief White Half-Oat kept promising everyone that he was going to die of pneumonia, and I guess I'll just have to be patient until the weather turns a little colder and damper." He scrutinized the chaplain perplexedly. "Don't you know all this? Don't you hear all the fellows talking about me?" "I don't think I've ever heard anyone mention you." "Well, I certainly can't understand that." The captain was piqued, but managed to carry on with a pretense of optimism. "Well, here it is almost September already, so I guess it won't be too long now. The next time any of the boys ask about me, why, just tell them I'll be back grinding out those old publicity releases again as soon as Chief White Half-Oat dies of pneumonia. Will you tell them that? Say I'll be back in the squadron as soon as winter comes and Chief White Half-Oat dies of pneumonia, okay?" The chaplain memorized the prophetic words solemnly, entranced further by their esoteric import. "Do you live on berries, herbs, and roots?" he asked. "No, of course not," the captain replied with surprise. "I sneak into the mess hall through the back and eat in the kitchen. Milo gives me sandwiches and milk." "What do you do when it rains?" The captain answered frankly, "I get wet." "Where do you sleep?" Swiftly, the captain ducked down into a crouch and began backing away. "You too?" he cried frantically. "Oh, no," cried the chaplain, "I swear to you." "You do want to cut my throat," the captain insisted. "I give you my word," the chaplain pleaded. But it was too late, for the homely hirsute specter had already vanished, dissolving so expertly inside the blooming, dappled, fragmented malformations of leaves, light, and shadows that the chaplain was already doubting that he had even been there. So many monstrous events were occurring that he was no longer positive which events were monstrous and which were really taking place. He wanted to find out about the madman in the woods as quickly as possible, to check if there ever really had been a Captain Flume. But his first chore, he recalled with reluctance, was to appease Corporal Whitcomb for neglecting to delegate enough responsibility to him. He plodded along the zigzagging path through the forest listlessly, clogged with thirst and feeling almost too exhausted to go on. He was remorseful when he thought of Corporal Whitcomb. He prayed that Corporal Whitcomb would be gone when he reached the clearing so that he could undress without embarrassment, wash his arms and chest and shoulders thoroughly, drink water, lie down refreshed, and perhaps even sleep for a few minutes. But he was in for still another disappointment and still another shock. for Corporal Whitcomb was Sergeant Whitcomb by the time he arrived, and was sitting with his shirt off in the chaplain's chair, sewing his new sergeant's stripes on his sleeve with the chaplain's needle and thread. Corporal Whitcomb had been promoted by Colonel Cathcart, who wanted to see the chaplain at once about the letters. "Oh, no," groaned the chaplain, sinking down dumbfounded on his cot. His warm canteen was empty, and he was too distraught to remember the Lister bag hanging outside in the shade between the two tents. "I can't believe it. I just can't believe that anyone would seriously believe that I've been forging Washington Irving's name." "Not those letters," Corporal Whitcomb corrected, plainly enjoying the chaplain's chagrin. "He wants to see you about the letters home to the families of casualties." "Those letters?" asked the chaplain with surprise. "That's right," Corporal Whitcomb gloated. "He's really going to chew you out for refusing to let me send them. You should have seen him go for the idea once I reminded him the letters could carry his signature. That's why he promoted me. He's absolutely sure they'll get him into the Saturday Evening Post." The chaplain's befuddlement increased. "But how did he know we were even considering the idea?" "I went to his office and told him." "You did what?" the chaplain demanded shrilly, and charged to his feet in an unfamiliar rage. "Do you mean to say that you actually went over my head to the colonel without asking my permission?" Corporal Whitcomb grinned brazenly with scornful satisfaction. "That's right, chaplain," he answered, "and you better not try to do anything about it if you know what's good for you." He laughed quietly in malicious defiance. "Colonel Cathcart isn't going to like it if he finds out you're getting even with me for bringing him my idea. You know something, chaplain?" Corporal Whitcomb continued, biting the chaplain's black thread apart contemptuously with a loud snap and buttoning on his shirt. "That dumb bastard really thinks it's one of the greatest ideas he's ever heard." "It might even get me into the Saturday Evening Post," Colonel Cathcart boasted in his office with a smile, swaggering back and forth convivially as he reproached the chaplain. "And you didn't have brains enough to appreciate it. You've got a good man in Corporal Whitcomb, chaplain. I hope you have brains enough to appreciate that." "Sergeant Whitcomb," the chaplain corrected before he could control himself. Colonel Cathcart glared. "I said Sergeant Whitcomb," he replied. "I wish you'd try listening once in a while instead of always finding fault. You don't want to be a captain all your life, do you?" "Sir?" "Well, I certainly don't see how you're ever going to amount to anything else if you keep on this way. Corporal Whitcomb feels that you fellows haven't had a fresh idea in 1944 years, and I'm inclined to agree with him. A bright boy, that Corporal Whitcomb. Well, it's all going to change." Colonel Cathcart sat down at his desk with a determined air and cleared a large, neat space in his blotter. When he had finished, he tapped his finger inside it. "Starting tomorrow," he said, "I want you and Corporal Whitcomb to write a letter of condolence for me to the next of kin of every man in the group who's killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. I want those letters to be sincere letters. I want them filled up with lots of personal details, so there'll be no doubt I mean every word you say. Is that clear?" The chaplain stepped forward impulsively to remonstrate. "But, sir, that's impossible," he blurted out. "We don't even know all the men that well." "What difference does that make?" Colonel Cathcart demanded, and then smiled amicably. "Corporal Whitcomb brought me this basic form letter that takes care of just about every situation. Listen. Dear Mrs., Mr., Miss, or Mr. and Mrs., words cannot express the deep personal grief I experienced when your husband, son, father, or brother was killed, wounded, or reported missing in action." And so on. I think that opening sentence sums up my sentiments exactly. Listen, maybe you'd better let Corporal Whitcomb take charge of the whole thing if you don't feel up to it. Colonel Cathcart whipped out his cigarette holder and flexed it between both hands like an onyx and ivory riding crop. "That's one of the things that's wrong with you, chaplain. Corporal Whitcomb tells me you don't know how to delegate responsibility. He says you've got no initiative either. You're not going to disagree with me, are you?" "No, sir." The chaplain shook his head, feeling despicably remiss because he did not know how to delegate responsibility and had no initiative, and because he really had been tempted to disagree with the colonel. His mind was a shambles. They were shooting skeet outside, and every time a gun was fired, his senses were jarred. He could not adjust to the sound of the shots. He was surrounded by bushels of plum tomatoes, and was almost convinced that he had stood in Colonel Cathcart's office on some similar occasion deep in the past, and had been surrounded by those same bushels of those same plum tomatoes. Déjà vu again. The setting seemed so familiar, yet it also seemed so distant. His clothes felt grimy and old, and he was deathly afraid he smelled. You take things too seriously, Chaplain, Colonel Cathcart told him bluntly, with an air of adult objectivity. That's another one of the things that's wrong with you. That long face of yours gets everybody depressed. Let me see you laugh once in a while. Come on, Chaplain. You give me a belly laugh right now, and I'll give you a whole bushel of plum tomatoes. He waited a second or two, watching, and then chortled victoriously. You see, Chaplain, I'm right. You can't give me a belly laugh, can you? No, sir, admitted the chaplain meekly, swallowing slowly with a visible effort. Not right now. I'm very thirsty. Then get yourself a drink. Colonel Corn keeps some bourbon in his desk. You ought to try dropping around the officers' club with us some evening just to have yourself a little fun. Try getting lit once in a while. I hope you don't feel you're better than the rest of us just because you're a professional man. Oh, no, sir, the chaplain assured him with embarrassment. As a matter of fact, I have been going to the officers' club the past few evenings. You're only a captain, you know, Colonel Cathcart continued, paying no attention to the chaplain's remark. You may be a professional man, but you're still only a captain. Yes, sir, I know. That's fine, then. It's just as well you didn't laugh before. I wouldn't have given you the plum tomatoes anyway. Corporal Whitcomb tells me you took a plum tomato when you were in here this morning. This morning? But, sir, you gave it to me. Colonel Cathcart cocked his head with suspicion. I didn't say I didn't give it to you, did I? I merely said you took it. I don't see why you've got such a guilty conscience if you really didn't steal it. Did I give it to you? Yes, sir, I swear you did. Then I'll just have to take your word for it, although I can't imagine why I'd want to give you a plum tomato. Colonel Cathcart transferred a round glass paperweight competently from the right edge of his desk to the left edge and picked up a sharpened pencil. Okay, Chaplain, I've got a lot of important work to do now, if you're through. You let me know when Corporal Whitcomb has sent out about a dozen of those letters, and we'll get in touch with the editors of the Saturday Evening Post. A sudden inspiration made his face brighten. Say, I think I'll volunteer the group for Avignon again. That should speed things up. For Avignon? The chaplain's heart missed a beat, and his flesh began to prickle and creep. That's right, the colonel explained exuberantly. The sooner we get some casualties, the sooner we can make some progress on this. I'd like to get in the Christmas issue if we can. I imagine the circulation is higher then. And to the chaplain's horror, the colonel lifted the phone to volunteer the group for Avignon and tried to kick him out of the officers' club again that very same night, a moment before Yossarian rose up drunkenly, knocking over his chair, to start an avenging punch that made Nately call out his name, and made Colonel Cathcart blanch and retreat prudently smack into General Dreedle, who shoved him off his bruised foot disgustedly and ordered him forward to kick the chaplain right back into the officers' club. It was all very upsetting to Colonel Cathcart. First, the dreaded name Yossarian tolling out again clearly like a warning of doom, and then General Dreedle's bruised foot, and that was another fault Colonel Cathcart found in the chaplain. The fact that it was impossible to predict how General Dreedle would react each time he saw him. Colonel Cathcart would never forget the first evening General Dreedle took notice of the chaplain in the officers' club, lifting his ruddy, sweltering, intoxicated face to stare ponderously through the yellow pall of cigarette smoke at the chaplain lurking near the wall by himself. Well, I'll be damned, General Dreedle had exclaimed hoarsely, his shaggy, gray, menacing eyebrows beetling in recognition. Is that a chaplain I see over there? That's really a fine thing when a man of God begins hanging around a place like this with a bunch of dirty drunks and gamblers. Colonel Cathcart compressed his lips primly and started to rise. I couldn't agree with you more, sir, he assented briskly in a tone of ostentatious disapproval. I just don't know what's happening to the clergy these days. They're getting better, that's what's happening to them, General Dreedle growled emphatically. Colonel Cathcart gulped awkwardly and made a nimble recovery. Yes, sir, they are getting better. That's exactly what I had in mind, sir. This is just the place for a chaplain to be, mingling with the men while they're out drinking and gambling so he can get to understand them and win their confidence. How the hell else is he ever going to get them to believe in God? That's exactly what I had in mind, sir, when I ordered him to come here, Colonel Cathcart said carefully, and threw his arm familiarly around the chaplain's shoulder as he walked him off into a corner to order him in a cold undertone to start reporting for duty at the officers' club every evening, to mingle with the men while they were drinking and gambling, so that he could get to understand them and win their confidence. The chaplain agreed and did report for duty to the officers' club every night to mingle with men who wanted to avoid him, until the evening the vicious fist fight broke out at the ping-pong table, and Chief White Half-Oat whirled without provocation and punched Colonel Moodus squarely in the nose, knocking Colonel Moodus down on the seat of his pants, and making General Dreedle roar with lusty, unexpected laughter, until he spied the chaplain standing close by, gawking at him grotesquely in tortured wonder. General Dreedel froze at the sight of him. He glowered at the chaplain with swollen fury for a moment, his good humor gone, and turned back toward the bar disgruntledly, rolling from side to side like a sailor on his short, bandy legs. Colonel Cathcart cantered fearfully along behind, glancing anxiously about in vain for some sign of help from Colonel Corn. "That's a fine thing," General Dreedel growled at the bar, gripping his empty shot glass in his burly hand. "That's really a fine thing, when a man of God begins hanging around a place like this with a bunch of dirty drunks and gamblers." Colonel Cathcart sighed with relief. "Yes, sir," he exclaimed proudly, "it certainly is a fine thing. Then why the hell don't you do something about it?" "Sir?" Colonel Cathcart inquired, blinking. "Do you think it does you credit to have your chaplain hanging around here every night? He's in here every goddamn time I come." "You're right, sir, absolutely right," Colonel Cathcart responded. "It does me no credit at all, and I am going to do something about it this very minute." "Aren't you the one who ordered him to come here?" "No, sir, that was Colonel Corn. I intend to punish him severely, too." "If he wasn't a chaplain," General Dreedel muttered, "I'd have him taken outside and shot." "He's not a chaplain, sir," Colonel Cathcart advised helpfully. "Isn't he? Then why the hell does he wear that cross on his collar if he's not a chaplain?" "He doesn't wear a cross on his collar, sir. He wears a silver leaf. He's a lieutenant colonel." "You've got a chaplain who's a lieutenant colonel?" inquired General Dreedel with amazement. "Oh, no, sir. My chaplain is only a captain." "Then why the hell does he wear a silver leaf on his collar if he's only a captain?" "He doesn't wear a silver leaf on his collar, sir. He wears a cross." "Go away from me now, you son of a bitch," said General Dreedel, "or I'll have you taken outside and shot." "Yes, sir." Colonel Cathcart went away from General Dreedel with a gulp and kicked the chaplain out of the officers' club, and it was exactly the way it almost was 2 months later, after the chaplain had tried to persuade Colonel Cathcart to rescind his order increasing the number of missions to 60, and had failed abysmally in that endeavor too. And the chaplain was ready now to capitulate to despair entirely, but was restrained by the memory of his wife, whom he loved and missed so pathetically, with such sensual and exalted ardor, and by the lifelong trust he had placed in the wisdom and justice of an immortal, omnipotent, omniscient, humane, universal, anthropomorphic, English-speaking, Anglo-Saxon, pro-American God, which had begun to waver. So many things were testing his faith. There was the Bible, of course, but the Bible was a book, and so were Bleak House, Treasure Island, Ethan Frome, and The Last of the Mohicans. Did it indeed seem probable, as he had once overheard Dunbar ask, that the answers to the riddles of creation would be supplied by people too ignorant to understand the mechanics of rainfall? Had Almighty God, in all his infinite wisdom, really been afraid that men 6,000 years ago would succeed in building a tower to heaven? Where the devil was heaven? Was it up? Down? There was no up or down in a finite but expanding universe in which even the vast, burning, dazzling, majestic sun was in a state of progressive decay that would eventually destroy the earth too. There were no miracles. Prayers went unanswered, and misfortune tramped with equal brutality on the virtuous and the corrupt. And the chaplain, who had conscience and character, would have yielded to reason and relinquished his belief in the God of his fathers, would truly have resigned both his calling and his commission and taken his chances as a private in the infantry or field artillery, or even perhaps as a corporal in the paratroopers, had it not been for such successive mystic phenomena as the naked man in the tree at that poor sergeant's funeral weeks before, and the cryptic, haunting, encouraging promise of the prophet Flume in the forest only that afternoon, "Tell them I'll be back when winter comes." Chapter 26, Arfi. In a way, it was all Yossarian's fault. For if he had not moved the bomb line during the big siege of Bologna, Major Blank de Coverley might still be around to save him. And if he had not stocked the enlisted men's apartment with girls who had no other place to live, Nately might never have fallen in love with his whore as she sat naked from the waist down in the room full of grumpy blackjack players who ignored her. Nately stared at her covertly from his overstuffed yellow armchair, marveling at the bored, phlegmatic strength with which she accepted the mass rejection. She yawned, and he was deeply moved. He had never witnessed such heroic poise before. The girl had climbed 5 steep flights of stairs to sell herself to the group of satiated enlisted men who had girls living there all around them. None wanted her at any price. not even after she had stripped without real enthusiasm to tempt them with a tall body that was firm and full and truly voluptuous. She seemed more fatigued than disappointed. Now she sat resting in vacuous indolence, watching the card game with dull curiosity as she gathered her recalcitrant energies for the tedious chore of donning the rest of her clothing and going back to work. In a little while she stirred. A little while later she rose with an unconscious sigh and stepped lethargically into her tight cotton panties and dark skirt, then buckled on her shoes and left. Nately slipped out behind her, and when Yossarian and Arfie entered the officer's apartment almost 2 hours later, there she was again, stepping into her panties and skirt, and it was almost like the chaplain's recurring sensation of having been through a situation before, except for Nately, who was moping inconsolably with his hands in his pockets. "She wants to go now," he said in a faint, strange voice. "She doesn't want to stay." "Why don't you just pay her some money to let you spend the rest of the day with her?" Yossarian advised. "She gave me my money back," Nately admitted. "She's tired of me now and wants to go looking for someone else." The girl paused, when her shoes were on, to glance in surly invitation at Yossarian and Arfie. Her breasts were pointy and large in the thin white sleeveless sweater she wore that squeezed each contour and flowed outward smoothly with the tops of her enticing hips. Yossarian returned her gaze and was strongly attracted. He shook his head. "Good riddance to bad rubbish," was Arfie's unperturbed response. "Don't say that about her," Nately protested with passion that was both a plea and a rebuke. "I want her to stay with me." "What's so special about her?" Arfie sneered with mock surprise. "She's only a whore." "And don't call her a whore." The girl shrugged impassively after a few more seconds and ambled toward the door. Nately bounded forward, wretchedly, to hold it open. He wandered back in a heartbroken daze, his sensitive face eloquent with grief. "Don't worry about it," Yossarian counseled him as kindly as he could. "You'll probably be able to find her again. We know where all the whores hang out." "Please don't call her that," Nately begged, looking as though he might cry. "I'm sorry," murmured Yossarian. Arfie thundered jovially. "There are hundreds of whores just as good crawling all over the streets. That one wasn't even pretty." He chuckled mellifluously with resonant disdain and authority. "Why, you rushed forward to open that door as though you were in love with her." "I think I am in love with her," Nately confessed in a shamed, far-off voice. Arfie wrinkled his chubby, round, rosy forehead in comic disbelief. "Ho, ho, ho, ho," he laughed, patting the expansive forest-green sides of his officer's tunic prosperously. "That's rich. You in love with her? That's really rich." Arfie had a date that same afternoon with a Red Cross girl from Smith, whose father owned an important milk of magnesia plant. Now that's the kind of girl you ought to be associating with, and not with common sluts like that one. Why, she didn't even look clean. "I don't care," Nately shouted desperately, "and I wish you'd shut up. I don't even want to talk about it with you." "Arfie, shut up," said Yossarian. "Ho, ho, ho, ho," Arfie continued. "I can just imagine what your father and mother would say if they knew you were running around with filthy trollops like that one. Your father is a very distinguished man, you know." "I'm not going to tell him," Nately declared with determination. "I'm not going to say a word about her to him or mother until after we're married." "Married?" Arfie's indulgent merriment swelled tremendously. "Ho, ho, 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 ho! Now you're really talking stupid. Why, you're not even old enough to know what true love is." Arfie was an authority on the subject of true love because he had already fallen truly in love with Nately's father, and with the prospect of working for him after the war in some executive capacity as a reward for befriending Nately. Arfie was a lead navigator who had never been able to find himself since leaving college. He was a genial, magnanimous lead navigator who could always forgive the other men in the squadron for denouncing him furiously each time he got lost on a combat mission and led them over concentrations of anti-aircraft fire. He got lost on the streets of Rome that same afternoon and never did find the eligible Red Cross girl from Smith with the important milk of magnesia plant. He got lost on the mission to Ferrara the day Kraft was shot down and killed, and he got lost again on the weekly milk run to Parma and tried to lead the planes out to sea over the city of Leghorn after Yossarian had dropped his bombs on the undefended inland target and settled back against his thick wall of armor plate with his eyes closed and a fragrant cigarette in his fingertips. Suddenly there was flak, and all at once McWatt was shrieking over the intercom, "Flak! Flak! Where the hell are we? What the hell's going on?" Yossarian flipped his eyes open in alarm and saw the totally unexpected, bulging black puffs of flak crashing down in toward them from high up, and Arfie's complacent, melon-round, tiny-eyed face gazing out at the approaching cannon bursts with affable bemusement. Yossarian was flabbergasted. His leg went abruptly to sleep. McWatt had started to climb and was yelping over the intercom for instructions. Yossarian sprang forward to see where they were and remained in the same place. He was unable to move. Then he realized he was sopping wet. He looked down at his crotch with a sinking, sick sensation. A wild crimson blot was crawling upward rapidly along his shirt front like an enormous sea monster rising to devour him. He was hit. Separate trickles of blood spilled to a puddle on the floor through one saturated trouser leg like countless unstoppable swarms of wriggling red worms. His heart stopped. A second solid jolt struck the plane. Yossarian shuddered with revulsion at the queer sight of his wound and screamed at Arfie for help. "I lost my balls, Arfie! I lost my balls!" Arfie didn't hear, and Yossarian bent forward and tugged at his arm. "Arfie, help me," he pleaded, almost weeping. "I'm hit! I'm hit!" Arfie turned slowly with a blind, quizzical grin. "What?" "I'm hit, Arfie, help me!" Arfie grinned again and shrugged amiably. "I can't hear you," he said. "Can't you see me?" Yossarian cried incredulously, and he pointed to the deepening pool of blood he felt splashing down all around him and spreading out underneath. "I'm wounded! Help me, for God's sake, Arfie, help me!" "I still can't hear you," Arfie complained tolerantly, cupping his podgy hand behind the blenched corolla of his ear. "What did you say?" Yossarian answered in a collapsing voice, weary suddenly of shouting so much, of the whole frustrating, exasperating, ridiculous situation. He was dying, and no one took notice. "Never mind." "What?" Arfie shouted. "I said I lost my balls. Can't you hear me? I'm wounded in the groin." "I still can't hear you," Arfie chided. "I said, never mind!" Yossarian screamed with a trapped feeling of terror and began to shiver, feeling very cold suddenly and very weak. Arfie shook his head regretfully again and lowered his obscene, lactescent ear almost directly into Yossarian's face. "You'll just have to speak up, my friend. You'll just have to speak up." "Leave me alone, you bastard! You dumb, insensitive bastard! Leave me alone!" Yossarian sobbed. He wanted to pummel Arfie, but lacked the strength to lift his arms. He decided to sleep instead and keeled over sideways into a dead faint. He was wounded in the thigh, and when he recovered consciousness, he found McWatt on both knees taking care of him. He was relieved, even though he still saw Arfie's bloated cherub's face hanging down over McWatt's shoulder with placid interest. Yossarian smiled feebly at McWatt, feeling ill, and asked, "Who's minding the store?" McWatt gave no sign that he heard. With growing horror, Yossarian gathered in breath and repeated the words as loudly as he could. McWatt looked up. "Christ, I'm glad you're alive," he exclaimed, heaving an enormous sigh. The good-humored, friendly crinkles about his eyes were white with tension and oily with grime. As he kept unrolling an interminable bandage around the bulky cotton compress, Yossarian felt strapped burdensomely to the inside of one thigh. "Nately's at the controls. The poor kid almost started bawling when he heard you were hit. He still thinks you're dead. They knocked open an artery for you, but I think I've got it stopped. I gave you some morphine." "Give me some more." "It might be too soon. I'll give you some more when it starts to hurt." "It hurts now." "Oh, well, what the hell," said McWatt, and injected another syringe of morphine into Yossarian's arm. "When you tell Nately I'm all right," said Yossarian to McWatt, and lost consciousness again as everything went fuzzy behind a film of strawberry-stained gelatin, and a great baritone buzz swallowed him in sound. He came to in the ambulance and smiled encouragement at Doc Danika's weevil-like, glum and overshadowed countenance for the dizzy second or two he had before everything went rose-petal pink again, and then turned really black and unfathomably still. Yossarian woke up in the hospital and went to sleep. When he woke up in the hospital again, the smell of ether was gone, and Dunbar was lying in pajamas in the bed across the aisle, maintaining that he was not Dunbar, but a fortiori. Yossarian thought he was cracked. He curled his lip skeptically at Dunbar's bit of news, and slept on it fitfully for a day or two, then woke up while the nurses were elsewhere, and eased himself out of bed to see for himself. The floor swayed like the floating raft at the beach. and the stitches on the inside of his thigh bit into his flesh like fine sets of fish teeth as he limped across the aisle to peruse the name on the temperature card on the foot of Dunbar's bed. But sure enough, Dunbar was right. He was not Dunbar anymore, but Second Lieutenant Anthony F. Fortiori. What the hell's going on? A. Fortiori got out of bed and motioned to Yossarian to follow, grasping for support at anything he could reach. Yossarian limped along after him out into the corridor and down the adjacent ward to a bed containing a harried young man with pimples and a receding chin. The harried young man rose on one elbow with alacrity as they approached. A. Fortiori jerked his thumb over his shoulder and said, "Screw." The harried young man jumped out of bed and ran away. A. Fortiori climbed into the bed and became Dunbar again. "That was A. Fortiori," Dunbar explained. "They didn't have an empty bed in your ward, so I pulled my rank and chased him back here into mine. It's a pretty satisfying experience, pulling rank. You ought to try it sometime. You ought to try it right now, in fact, because you look like you're going to fall down." Yossarian felt like he was going to fall down. He turned to the lantern-jawed, leather-faced, middle-aged man lying in the bed next to Dunbar's, jerked his thumb over his shoulder and said, "Screw." The middle-aged man stiffened fiercely and glared. "He's a major," Dunbar explained. "Why don't you aim a little lower and try becoming Warrant Officer Homer Lumley for a while? Then you can have a father in the state legislature and a sister who's engaged to a champion skier. Just tell him you're a captain." Yossarian turned to the startled patient Dunbar had indicated. "I'm a captain," he said, jerking his thumb over his shoulder. "Screw." The startled patient jumped down to the floor at Yossarian's command and ran away. Yossarian climbed up into his bed and became Warrant Officer Homer Lumley, who felt like vomiting and was covered suddenly with a clammy sweat. He slept for an hour and wanted to be Yossarian again. It did not mean so much to have a father in the state legislature and a sister who was engaged to a champion skier. Dunbar led the way back to Yossarian's ward, where he thumbed A. Fortiori out of bed to become Dunbar again for a while. There was no sign of Warrant Officer Homer Lumley. Nurse Kramer was there, though, and sizzled with sanctimonious anger like a damp firecracker. She ordered Yossarian to get right back into his bed and blocked his path so he couldn't comply. Her pretty face was more repulsive than ever. Nurse Kramer was a good-hearted, sentimental creature who rejoiced unselfishly at news of weddings, engagements, births, and anniversaries, even though she was unacquainted with any of the people involved. Catch-22 by Joseph Heller, continued. Nurse Kramer was a good-hearted, sentimental creature who rejoiced unselfishly at news of weddings, engagements, births, and anniversaries, even though she was unacquainted with any of the people involved. "Are you crazy?" she scolded virtuously, shaking an indignant finger in front of his eyes. "I suppose you just don't care if you kill yourself, do you?" "It's myself," he reminded her. "I suppose you just don't care if you lose your leg, do you?" "It's my leg." "It certainly is not your leg," Nurse Kramer retorted. "That leg belongs to the U.S. government. It's no different than a gear or a bedpan. The Army has invested a lot of money to make you an airplane pilot, and you've no right to disobey the doctor's orders." Yossarian was not sure he liked being invested in. Nurse Kramer was still standing directly in front of him so that he could not pass. His head was aching. Nurse Kramer shouted at him some question he could not understand. He jerked his thumb over his shoulder and said, "Screw." Nurse Kramer cracked him in the face so hard she almost knocked him down. Yossarian drew back his fist to punch her in the jaw, just as his leg buckled and he began to fall. Nurse Duckett strode up in time to catch him. She addressed them both firmly. "Just what's going on here?" "He won't get back into his bed," Nurse Kramer reported zealously in an injured tone. "Sue Ann, he said something absolutely horrible to me. Oh, I can't even make myself repeat it." "She called me a gear," Yossarian muttered. Nurse Duckett was not sympathetic. "Will you get back into bed," she said, "or must I take you by your ear and put you there?" "Take me by my ear and put me there," Yossarian dared her. Nurse Duckett took him by his ear and put him back in bed. Chapter 27. Nurse Duckett. Nurse Sue Ann Duckett was a tall, spare, mature, straight-backed woman with a prominent, well-rounded ass, small breasts, and angular, ascetic New England features that came equally close to being very lovely and very plain. Her skin was white and pink, her eyes small, her nose and chin slender and sharp. She was able, prompt, strict, and intelligent. She welcomed responsibility and kept her head in every crisis. She was adult and self-reliant, and there was nothing she needed from anyone. Yossarian took pity and decided to help her. Next morning, while she was standing bent over smoothing the sheets at the foot of his bed, he slipped his hand stealthily into the narrow space between her knees and all at once brought it up swiftly under her dress as far as it would go. Nurse Duckett shrieked and jumped into the air a mile, but it wasn't high enough, and she squirmed and vaulted and seesawed back and forth on her divine fulcrum for almost a full 15 seconds before she wiggled free finally and retreated frantically into the aisle with an ashen, trembling face. She backed away too far, and Dunbar, who had watched from the beginning, sprang forward on his bed without warning and flung both arms around her bosom from behind. Nurse Duckett let out another scream and twisted away, fleeing far enough from Dunbar for Yossarian to lunge forward and grab her by the snatch again. Nurse Duckett bounced out across the aisle once more like a ping-pong ball with legs. Dunbar was waiting vigilantly, ready to pounce. She remembered him just in time and leaped aside. Dunbar missed completely and sailed by her over the bed to the floor, landing on his skull with a soggy, crunching thud that knocked him cold. He woke up on the floor with a bleeding nose and exactly the same distressful head symptoms he had been feigning all along. The ward was in a chaotic uproar. Nurse Duckett was in tears, and Yossarian was consoling her apologetically as he sat beside her on the edge of a bed. The commanding colonel was wroth and shouting at Yossarian that he would not permit his patients to take indecent liberties with his nurses. "What do you want from him?" Dunbar asked plaintively from the floor, wincing at the vibrating pains in his temples that his voice set up. "He didn't do anything." "I'm talking about you," the thin, dignified colonel bellowed as loudly as he could. "You're going to be punished for what you did." "What did you want from him?" Yossarian called out. "All he did was fall on his head." "And I'm talking about you, too," the colonel declared, whirling to rage at Yossarian. "You're going to be good and sorry you grabbed Nurse Duckett by the bosom." "I didn't grab Nurse Duckett by the bosom," said Yossarian. "I grabbed her by the bosom," said Dunbar. "Are you both crazy?" the doctor cried shrilly, backing away in paling confusion. "Yes, he really is crazy, Doc," Dunbar assured him. "Every night he dreams he's holding a live fish in his hands." The doctor stopped in his tracks with a look of elegant amazement and distaste, and the ward grew still. "He does what?" he demanded. "He dreams he's holding a live fish in his hand." "What kind of fish?" the doctor inquired sternly of Yossarian. "I don't know," Yossarian answered. "I can't tell one kind of fish from another." "In which hand do you hold them?" "It varies," answered Yossarian. "It varies with the fish," Dunbar added helpfully. The colonel turned and stared down at Dunbar suspiciously with a narrow squint. "Yes, and how come you seem to know so much about it?" "I'm in the dream," Dunbar answered without cracking a smile. The colonel's face flushed with embarrassment. He glared at them both with cold, unforgiving resentment. "Get up off the floor and into your bed," he directed Dunbar through thin lips, "and I don't want to hear another word about this dream from either one of you. I've got a man on my staff to listen to disgusting bilge like this." "Just why do you think," carefully inquired Major Sanderson, the soft and thick-set smiling staff psychiatrist to whom the colonel had ordered Yossarian sent, "that Colonel Ferridge finds your dream disgusting?" Yossarian replied respectfully, "I suppose it's either some quality in the dream or some quality in Colonel Ferridge." "That's very well put," applauded Major Sanderson, who wore squeaking GI shoes and had charcoal black hair that stood up almost straight. "For some reason," he confided, "Colonel Ferridge has always reminded me of a seagull. He doesn't put much faith in psychiatry, you know." "You don't like seagulls, do you?" inquired Yossarian. "No, not very much," admitted Major Sanderson with a sharp, nervous laugh, as he pulled at his pendulous second chin lovingly as though it were a long goatee. "I think your dream is charming, and I hope it recurs frequently so that we can continue discussing it. Would you like a cigarette?" He smiled when Yossarian declined. "Just why do you think," he asked knowingly, "that you have such a strong aversion to accepting a cigarette from me?" "I put out one a second ago. It's still smoldering in your ashtray." Major Sanderson chuckled. "That's a very ingenious explanation, but I suppose we'll soon discover the true reason." He tied a sloppy double bow in his open shoelace, and then transferred a lined yellow pad from his desk to his lap. "The fish you dream about. Let's talk about that. It's always the same fish, isn't it?" "I don't know," Yossarian replied. "I have trouble recognizing fish." "What does the fish remind you of?" "Other fish." "And what do other fish remind you of?" "Other fish?" Major Sanderson sat back disappointedly. "Do you like fish?" "Not especially." "Just why do you think you have such a morbid aversion to fish?" asked Major Sanderson triumphantly. "They're too bland," Yossarian answered, "and too bony." Major Sanderson nodded understandingly, with a smile that was agreeable and insincere. "That's a very interesting explanation, but we'll soon discover the true reason, I suppose. Do you like this particular fish, the one you're holding in your hand?" "I have no feelings about it either way." "Do you dislike the fish? Do you have any hostile or aggressive emotions toward it?" "No, not at all. In fact, I rather like the fish." "Then you do like the fish." "Oh, no, I have no feelings toward it either way." "But you just said you liked it, and now you say you have no feelings toward it either way. I've just caught you in a contradiction, don't you see?" "Yes, sir, I suppose you have caught me in a contradiction." Major Sanderson proudly lettered "contradiction" on his pad with his thick black pencil. "Just why do you think," he resumed when he had finished looking up, "that you made those two statements expressing contradictory emotional responses to the fish?" "I suppose I have an ambivalent attitude toward it." Major Sanderson sprang up with joy when he heard the words ambivalent attitude. "You do understand," he exclaimed, wringing his hands together ecstatically. "Oh, you can't imagine how lonely it's been for me, talking day after day to patients who haven't the slightest knowledge of psychiatry, trying to cure people who have no real interest in me or my work. It's given me such a terrible feeling of inadequacy." A shadow of anxiety crossed his face. "I can't seem to shake it." "Really?" asked Yossarian, wondering what else to say. "Why do you blame yourself for gaps in the education of others?" "It's silly, I know," Major Sanderson replied uneasily, with a giddy, involuntary laugh. "But I've always depended very heavily on the good opinion of others. I reached puberty a bit later than all the other boys my age, you see, and it's given me all sorts of problems. I just know I'm going to enjoy discussing them with you. I'm so eager to begin that I'm almost reluctant to digress now to your problem, but I'm afraid I must. Colonel Farage would be cross if he knew we were spending all our time on me. I'd like to show you some ink blots now to find out what certain shapes and colors remind you of." "You can save yourself the trouble, Doctor. Everything reminds me of sex." "Does it?" cried Major Sanderson with delight, as though unable to believe his ears. "Now we're really getting somewhere. Do you ever have any good sex dreams?" "My fish dream is a sex dream." "No, I mean real sex dreams. The kind where you grab some naked bitch by the neck and pinch her and punch her in the face until she's all bloody, and then throw yourself down to ravish her and burst into tears because you love her and hate her so much you don't know what else to do. That's the kind of sex dreams I like to talk about. Don't you ever have sex dreams like that?" Yossarian reflected a moment with a wise look. "That's a fish dream," he decided. Major Sanderson recoiled as though he had been slapped. "Yes, of course," he conceded frigidly, his manner changing to one of edgy, defensive antagonism. "But I'd like you to dream one like that anyway, just to see how you react. That will be all for today. In the meantime, I'd also like you to dream up the answers to some of those questions I asked you. These sessions are no more pleasant for me than they are for you, you know." "I'll mention it to Dunbar," Yossarian replied. "Dunbar? He's the one who started it all. It's his dream." "Oh, Dunbar," Major Sanderson sneered, his confidence returning. "I'll bet Dunbar is that evil fellow who really does all those nasty things you're always being blamed for, isn't he?" "He's not so evil." "And yet you'll defend him to the very death, won't you?" "Not that far." Major Sanderson smiled tauntingly and wrote Dunbar on his pad. "Why are you limping?" he asked sharply as Yossarian moved to the door. "And what the devil is that bandage doing on your leg? Are you mad or something?" "I was wounded in the leg. That's what I'm in the hospital for." "Oh, no, you're not," gloated Major Sanderson maliciously. "You're in the hospital for a stone in your salivary gland. So you're not so smart after all, are you? You don't even know what you're in the hospital for." "I'm in the hospital for a wounded leg," Yossarian insisted. Major Sanderson ignored his argument with a sarcastic laugh. "Well, give my regards to your friend Dunbar, and you will tell him to dream that dream for me, won't you?" But Dunbar had nausea and dizziness with his constant headache, and was not inclined to cooperate with Major Sanderson. Hungry Joe had nightmares because he had finished 60 missions and was waiting again to go home. but he was unwilling to share any when he came to the hospital to visit. "Hasn't anyone got any dreams for Major Sanderson?" Yossarian asked. "I hate to disappoint him. He feels so rejected already." "I've been having a very peculiar dream ever since I learned you were wounded," confessed the chaplain. "I used to dream every night that my wife was dying or being murdered, or that my children were choking to death on morsels of nutritious food. Now I dream that I'm out swimming in water over my head, and a shark is eating my left leg in exactly the same place where you have your bandage." "That's a wonderful dream," Dunbar declared. "I bet Major Sanderson will love it." "That's a horrible dream," Major Sanderson cried. "It's filled with pain and mutilation and death. I'm sure you had it just to spite me. You know, I'm not even sure you belong in the army with a disgusting dream like that." Yossarian thought he spied a ray of hope. "Perhaps you're right, sir," he suggested slyly. "Perhaps I ought to be grounded and returned to the States. Hasn't it ever occurred to you that in your promiscuous pursuit of women, you are merely trying to assuage your subconscious fears of sexual impotence?" "Yes, sir, it has." "Then why do you do it? To assuage my fears of sexual impotence." "Why don't you get yourself a good hobby instead?" Major Sanderson inquired with friendly interest. "Like fishing. Do you really find Nurse Duckett so attractive? I should think she was rather bony. Rather bland and bony, you know, like a fish." "I hardly know Nurse Duckett." "Then why did you grab her by the bosom, merely because she has one?" "Dunbar did that." "Oh, don't start that again," Major Sanderson exclaimed with vitriolic scorn and hurled down his pencil disgustedly. "Do you really think that you can absolve yourself of guilt by pretending to be someone else? I don't like you, Fortiori. Do you know that? I don't like you at all." Yossarian felt a cold, damp wind of apprehension blow over him. "I'm not Fortiori, sir," he said timidly. "I'm Yossarian." "You're who?" "My name is Yossarian, sir, and I'm in the hospital with a wounded leg." "Your name is Fortiori," Major Sanderson contradicted him belligerently, "and you're in the hospital for a stone in your salivary gland." "Oh, come on, Major," Yossarian exploded. "I ought to know who I am." "And I've got an official Army record here to prove it," Major Sanderson retorted. "You'd better get a grip on yourself before it's too late. First you're Dunbar, now you're Yossarian. The next thing you know, you'll be claiming you're Washington Irving. Do you know what's wrong with you? You've got a split personality, that's what's wrong with you." "Perhaps you're right, sir," Yossarian agreed diplomatically. "I know I'm right. You've got a bad persecution complex. You think people are trying to harm you. People are trying to harm me. You see? You have no respect for excessive authority or obsolete traditions. You're dangerous and depraved, and you ought to be taken outside and shot." "Are you serious?" "You're an enemy of the people." "Are you nuts?" Yossarian shouted. "No, I'm not nuts," Dobbs roared furiously back in the ward in what he imagined was a furtive whisper. "Hungry Joe saw them, I tell you. He saw them yesterday when he flew to Naples to pick up some black market air conditioners for Colonel Cathcart's farm. They've got a big replacement center there, and it's filled with hundreds of pilots, bombardiers, and gunners on the way home. They've got 45 missions, that's all. A few with Purple Hearts have even less. Replacement crews are pouring in from the States into the other bomber groups. They want everyone to serve overseas at least once, even administrative personnel. Don't you read the papers? We've got to kill him now." "You've got only 2 more missions to fly," Yossarian reasoned with him in a low voice. "Why take a chance?" "I can get killed flying them, too," Dobbs answered pugnaciously in his rough, quavering, overwrought voice. "We can kill him the first thing tomorrow morning when he drives back from his farm. I've got the gun right here." Yossarian goggled with amazement as Dobbs pulled a gun out of his pocket and displayed it high in the air. "Are you crazy?" he hissed frantically. "Put it away, and keep your idiot voice down." "What are you worried about?" Dobbs asked with offended innocence. "No one can hear us." "Hey, knock it off down there," a voice rang out from the far end of the ward. "Can't you see we're trying to nap?" "What the hell are you, a wise guy?" Dobbs yelled back and spun around with clenched fists, ready to fight. He whirled back to Yossarian, and before he could speak, sneezed thunderously 6 times, staggering sideways on rubbery legs in the intervals, and raising his elbows ineffectively to fend each seizure off. The lids of his watery eyes were puffy and inflamed. "Who does he think?" he demanded, sniffing spasmodically and wiping his nose with the back of his sturdy wrist. "He is. A cop or something?" "He's a CID man," Yossarian notified him tranquilly. "We've got 3 here now, and more on the way. Oh, don't be scared. They're after a forger named Washington Irving. They're not interested in murderers." "Murderers?" Dobbs was affronted. "Why do you call us murderers? Just because we're going to murder Colonel Cathcart?" "Be quiet, damn you," directed Yossarian. "Can't you whisper?
I am whispering. You're still shouting. No, I'm not. Hey, shut up down there, will you? Patients all over the ward began hollering at Dobbs. I'll fight you all, Dobbs screamed back at them, and stood up on a rickety wooden chair, waving the gun wildly. Yossarian caught his arm and yanked him down. Dobbs began sneezing again. I have an allergy, he apologized when he had finished, his nostrils running and his eyes streaming with tears. That's too bad. You'd make a great leader of men without it. Colonel Cathcart's the murderer, Dobbs complained hoarsely when he had shoved away a soiled, crumpled khaki handkerchief. Colonel Cathcart's the one who's going to murder us all if we don't do something to stop him. Maybe he won't raise the missions anymore. Maybe 60 is as high as he'll go. He always raises the missions. You know that better than I do. Dobbs swallowed and bent his intense face very close to Yossarian's, the muscles in his bronze rock-like jaw bunching up into quivering knots. Just say it's okay, and I'll do the whole thing tomorrow morning. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I'm whispering now, ain't I? Yossarian tore his eyes away from the gaze of burning entreaty Dobbs had fastened on him. Why the goddamn hell don't you just go out and do it, he protested. Why don't you stop talking to me about it and do it alone? I'm afraid to do it alone. I'm afraid to do anything alone. Then leave me out of it. I'd have to be crazy to get mixed up in something like this now. I've got $1 million leg wound here. They're going to send me home. Are you crazy? Dobbs exclaimed in disbelief. All you've got there is a scratch. He'll put you back flying combat missions the day you come out, Purple Heart and all. Then I really will kill him, Yossarian vowed. I'll come looking for you and we'll do it together. Then let's do it tomorrow while we've still got the chance, Dobbs pleaded. The chaplain says he's volunteered the group for Avignon again. I may be killed before you get out. Look how these hands of mine shake. I can't fly a plane. I'm not good enough. Yossarian was afraid to say yes. I want to wait and see what happens first. The trouble with you is that you just won't do anything, Dobbs complained in a thick, infuriated voice. I'm doing everything I possibly can, the chaplain explained softly to Yossarian after Dobbs had departed. I even went to the medical tent to speak to Dr. Nika about helping you. Yes, I can see. Yossarian suppressed a smile. What happened? They painted my gums purple, the chaplain replied sheepishly. They painted his toes purple, too, Nately added in outrage, and then they gave him a laxative. But I went back again this morning to see him, and they painted his gums purple again, said Nately. But I did get to speak to him, the chaplain argued in a plaintive tone of self-justification. Dr. Nika seems like such an unhappy man. He suspects that someone is plotting to transfer him to the Pacific Ocean. All this time he's been thinking of coming to me for help. When I told him I needed his help, he wondered if there wasn't a chaplain I couldn't go see. The chaplain waited in patient dejection when Yossarian and Dunbar both broke into laughter. I used to think it was immoral to be unhappy, he continued, as though keening aloud in solitude. Now I don't know what to think anymore. I'd like to make the subject of immorality the basis of my sermon this Sunday, but I'm not sure I ought to give any sermon at all with these purple gums. Colonel Corn was very displeased with them. Chaplain, why don't you come into the hospital with us for a while and take it easy, Yossarian invited. You could be very comfortable here. The brash iniquity of the proposal tempted and amused the chaplain for a second or two. No, I don't think so, he decided reluctantly. I want to arrange for a trip to the mainland to see a mail clerk named Wintergreen. Dr. Danica told me he could help. Wintergreen is probably the most influential man in the whole theater of operations. He's not only a mail clerk, but he has access to a mimeograph machine. But he won't help anybody. That's one of the reasons he'll go far. I'd like to speak to him anyway. There must be somebody who will help you. Do it for Dunbar, Chaplain, Yossarian corrected with a superior air. I've got this $1 million leg wound that will take me out of combat. If that doesn't do it, there's a psychiatrist who thinks I'm not good enough to be in the Army. I'm the one who isn't good enough to be in the Army, Dunbar whined jealously. It was my dream. It's not the dream, Dunbar, Yossarian explained. He likes your dream. It's my personality. He thinks it's split. It's split right down the middle, said Major Sanderson, who had laced his lumpy GI shoes for the occasion and had slicked his charcoal dull hair down with some stiffening and redolent tonic. He smiled ostentatiously to show himself reasonable and nice. I'm not saying that to be cruel and insulting, he continued with cruel and insulting delight. I'm not saying it because I hate you and want revenge. I'm not saying it because you rejected me and hurt my feelings terribly. No, I'm a man of medicine, and I'm being coldly objective. I have very bad news for you. Are you man enough to take it?" "God, no!" screamed Yossarian. "I'll go right to pieces." Major Sanderson flew instantly into a rage. "Can't you even do one thing right?" he pleaded, turning beet red with vexation and crashing the sides of both fists down upon his desk together. "The trouble with you is that you think you're too good for all the conventions of society. You probably think you're too good for me, too, just because I arrived at puberty late. Well, do you know what you are? You're a frustrated, unhappy, disillusioned, undisciplined, maladjusted young man." Major Sanderson's disposition seemed to mellow as he reeled off the uncomplimentary adjectives. "Yes, sir," Yossarian agreed carefully. "I guess you're right." "Of course I'm right. You're immature. You've been unable to adjust to the idea of war." "Yes, sir." "You have a morbid aversion to dying. You probably resent the fact that you're at war and might get your head blown off any second." "I more than resent it, sir. I'm absolutely incensed." "You have deep-seated survival anxieties, and you don't like bigots, bullies, snobs, or hypocrites. Subconsciously, there are many people you hate." "Consciously, sir, consciously," Yossarian corrected in an effort to help. "I hate them consciously. You're antagonistic to the idea of being robbed, exploited, degraded, humiliated, or deceived. Misery depresses you. Ignorance depresses you. Persecution depresses you. Violence depresses you. Slums depress you. Greed depresses you. Crime depresses you. Corruption depresses you. You know, it wouldn't surprise me if you're a manic depressive." "Yes, sir. Perhaps I am. Don't try to deny it." "I'm not denying it, sir," said Yossarian, pleased with the miraculous rapport that finally existed between them. "I agree with all you've said." "Then you admit you're crazy, do you?" "Crazy?" Yossarian was shocked. "What are you talking about? Why am I crazy? You're the one who's crazy." Major Sanderson turned red with indignation again and crashed both fists down upon his thighs. "Calling me crazy," he shouted in a sputtering rage, "is a typically sadistic and vindictive paranoiac reaction. You really are crazy. Then why don't you send me home?" "And I'm going to send you home." "They're going to send me home," Yossarian announced jubilantly as he hobbled back into the ward. "Me too," A. Fortiori rejoiced. "They just came to my ward and told me." "What about me?" Dunbar demanded petulantly of the doctors. "You," they replied with asperity. "You're going with Yossarian right back into combat." And back into combat they both went. Yossarian was enraged when the ambulance returned him to the squadron, and he went limping for justice to Dr. Nika, who glared at him glumly with misery and disdain. "You!" Dr. Nika exclaimed mournfully with accusing disgust, the egg-shaped pouches under both eyes firm and censorious. "All you ever think of is yourself. Go take a look at the bomb line if you want to see what's been happening since you went to the hospital." Yossarian was startled. "Are we losing?" "Losing?" Dr. Nika cried. "The whole military situation has been going to hell ever since we captured Paris. I knew it would happen." He paused, his sulking ire turning to melancholy, and frowned irritably as though it were all Yossarian's fault. "American troops are pushing into German soil. The Russians have captured back all of Romania. Only yesterday the Greeks in the 8th Army captured Rimini. The Germans are on the defensive everywhere." Dr. Nika paused again and fortified himself with a huge breath for a piercing ejaculation of grief. "There's no more Luftwaffe left," he wailed. He seemed ready to burst into tears. "The whole Gothic line is in danger of collapsing." "So?" asked Yossarian. "What's wrong?" "What's wrong?" Dr. Nika cried. "If something doesn't happen soon, Germany may surrender, and then we'll all be sent to the Pacific." Yossarian gawked at Dr. Nika in grotesque dismay. "Are you crazy? Do you know what you're saying?" "Yeah, it's easy for you to laugh," Dr. Nika sneered. "Who the hell is laughing?" "At least you've got a chance. You're in combat and might get killed, but what about me? I've got nothing to hope for." "You're out of your goddamn head," Yossarian shouted at him emphatically, seizing him by the shirt front. "Do you know that? Now keep your stupid mouth shut and listen to me." Dr. Nika wrenched himself away. "Don't you dare talk to me like that. I'm a licensed physician." Then keep your stupid licensed physician's mouth shut and listen to what they told me up at the hospital. I'm crazy. Did you know that? So? Really crazy. So? I'm nuts cuckoo, don't you understand? I'm off my rocker. They sent someone else home in my place by mistake. They've got a licensed psychiatrist up at the hospital who examined me, and that was his verdict. I'm really insane. So? So? Yossarian was puzzled by Dr. Nika's inability to comprehend. Don't you see what that means? Now you can take me off combat duty and send me home. They're not going to send a crazy man out to be killed, are they? Who else will go? Chapter 28. Dobbs. McWatt went, and McWatt was not crazy. And so did Yossarian, still walking with a limp. And when Yossarian had gone 2 more times, and then found himself menaced by the rumor of another mission to Bologna, he limped determinedly into Dobbs' tent early one warm afternoon, put a finger to his mouth, and said, "Shush." "What are you shushing him for?" asked Kid Sampson, peeling a tangerine with his front teeth as he perused the dog-eared pages of a comic book. "He isn't even saying anything." "Screw," said Yossarian to Kid Sampson, jerking his thumb back over his shoulder toward the entrance of the tent. Kid Sampson cocked his blond eyebrows discerningly and rose to cooperate. He whistled upward 4 times into his drooping yellow mustache and spurted away into the hills on the dented old green motorcycle he had purchased second-hand months before. Yossarian waited until the last faint bark of the motor had died away in the distance. Things inside the tent did not seem quite normal. The place was too neat. Dobbs was watching him curiously, smoking a fat cigar. Now that Yossarian had made up his mind to be brave, he was deathly afraid. "All right," he said. "Let's kill Colonel Cathcart. We'll do it together." Dobbs sprang forward off his cot with a look of wildest terror. "Shush!" he roared. "Kill Colonel Cathcart? What are you talking about?" "Be quiet, damn it!" Yossarian snarled. "The whole island will hear. Have you still got that gun?" "Are you crazy or something?" shouted Dobbs. "Why should I want to kill Colonel Cathcart?" "Why?" Yossarian stared at Dobbs with an incredulous scowl. "Why? It was your idea, wasn't it? Didn't you come to the hospital and ask me to do it?" Dobbs smiled slowly. "But that was when I had only 58 missions," he explained, puffing on his cigar luxuriously. "I'm all packed now, and I'm waiting to go home. I've finished my 60 missions." "So what?" Yossarian replied. "He's only going to raise them again." "Maybe this time he won't." "He always raises them. What the hell's the matter with you, Dobbs? Ask Hungry Joe how many times he's packed his bags." "I've got to wait and see what happens," Dobbs maintained stubbornly. "I'd have to be crazy to get mixed up in something like this now that I'm out of combat." He flicked the ash from his cigar. "No, my advice to you," he remarked, "is that you fly your 60 missions like the rest of us and then see what happens." Yossarian resisted the impulse to spit squarely in his eye. "I may not live through 60, he wheedled in a flat, pessimistic voice. "There's a rumor around that he's volunteered the group for Bologna again." "It's only a rumor," Dobbs pointed out with a self-important air. "You mustn't believe every rumor you hear." "Will you stop giving me advice?" "Why don't you speak to Orr?" Dobbs advised. "Orr got knocked down into the water again last week on that second mission to Avignon. Maybe he's unhappy enough to kill him." "Orr hasn't got brains enough to be unhappy." Orr had been knocked down into the water again while Yossarian was still in the hospital, and had eased his crippled airplane down gently into the glassy blue swells off Marseille with such flawless skill that not one member of the 6-man crew suffered the slightest bruise. The escape hatches in the front and rear sections flew open while the sea was still foaming white and green around the plane, and the men scrambled out as speedily as they could into their flaccid orange Mae West life jackets that failed to inflate and dangled limp and useless around their necks and waists. The life jackets failed to inflate because Milo had removed the twin carbon dioxide cylinders from the inflating chambers to make the strawberry and crushed pineapple ice cream sodas he served in the officers' mess hall, and had replaced them with mimeographed notes that read, "What's good for M&M Enterprises is good for the country," or popped out of the sinking airplane last. You should have seen him, Sergeant Knight roared with laughter as he related the episode to Yossarian. It was the funniest goddamn thing you ever saw. None of the Mae Wests would work because Milo had stolen the carbon dioxide to make those ice cream sodas you bastards have been getting in the officers' mess. But that wasn't too bad, as it turned out. Only one of us couldn't swim, and we lifted that guy up into the raft after Orr had worked it over by its rope right up against the fuselage while we were all still standing on the plane. That little crackpot sure has a knack for things like that. Then the other raft came loose and drifted away, so that all 6 of us wound up sitting in one, with our elbows and legs pressed so close against each other, you almost couldn't move without knocking the guy next to you out of the raft into the water. The plane went down about 3 seconds after we left it, and we were out there all alone, and right after that we began unscrewing the caps on our Mae Wests to see what the hell had gone wrong, and found those goddamn notes from Milo telling us that what was good for him was good enough for the rest of us. That bastard. Jesus, did we curse him. All except that buddy of yours, Orr, who just kept grinning as though for all he cared, what was good for Milo might be good enough for the rest of us. I swear you should have seen him sitting up there on the rim of the raft like the captain of a ship, while the rest of us just watched him and waited for him to tell us what to do. He kept slapping his hands on his legs every few seconds as though he had the shakes, and saying, "All right now, all right," and giggling like a crazy little freak. Then saying, "All right now, all right," again, and giggling like a crazy little freak some more. It was like watching some kind of a moron. Watching him was all that kept us from going to pieces altogether during the first few minutes, what with each wave washing over us into the raft, or dumping a few of us back into the water so that we had to climb back in again before the next wave came along and washed us right back out. It was sure funny. We just kept falling out and climbing back in. We had the guy who couldn't swim stretched out in the middle of the raft on the floor, but even there he almost drowned because the water inside the raft was deep enough to keep splashing in his face. Oh, boy. Then Orr began opening up compartments in the raft, and the fun really began. First he found a box of chocolate bars, and he passed those around, so we sat there eating salty, wet chocolate bars while the waves kept knocking us out of the raft into the water. Next he found some bouillon cubes and aluminum cups and made us some soup. Then he found some tea. Sure, he made it. Can't you see him serving us tea as we sat there soaking wet in water up to our ass? Now, I was falling out of the raft because I was laughing so much. We were all laughing, and he was dead serious except for that goofy giggle of his and that crazy grin. What a jerk. Whatever he found, he used. He found some shark repellent, and he sprinkled it right out into the water. He found some marker dye, and he threw it into the water. The next thing he finds is a fishing line and dried bait, and his face lights up as though the air-sea rescue launch had just sped up to save us before we died of exposure, or before the Germans sent a boat out from Spezia to take us prisoner or machine gun us. In no time at all, Orr had that fishing line out into the water, trolling away as happy as a lark. "Lieutenant, what do you expect to catch?" I asked him. "Cod," he told me, and he meant it, and it's a good thing he didn't catch any, because he would have eaten that codfish raw if he had caught any, and would have made us eat it too, because he had found this little book that said it was all right to eat codfish raw. The next thing he found was this little blue oar about the size of a Dixie cup spoon, and sure enough he began rowing with it, trying to move all 900 pounds of us with that little stick. Can you imagine? After that he found a small magnetic compass and a big waterproof map, and he spread the map open on his knees and set the compass on top of it, and that's how he spent the time until the launch picked us up about 30 minutes later, sitting there with that baited fishing line out behind him, with the compass in his lap and the map spread out on his knees, and paddling away as hard as he could with that dinky blue oar, as though he was speeding to Majorca. Jesus! Sergeant Knight knew all about Majorca, and so did Orr, because Yossarian had told them often of such sanctuaries as Spain, Switzerland, and Sweden, where American flyers could be interned for the duration of the war under conditions of utmost ease and luxury, merely by flying there. Yossarian was the squadron's leading authority on internment, and had already begun plotting an emergency heading into Switzerland on every mission he flew into northernmost Italy. He would certainly have preferred Sweden, where the level of intelligence was high, and where he could swim nude with beautiful girls with low, demurring voices, and sire whole, happy, undisciplined tribes of illegitimate Yossarians that the state would assist through parturition and launch into life without stigma. But Sweden was out of reach, too far away, and Yossarian waited for the piece of flak that would knock out one engine over the Italian Alps and provide him with the excuse for heading for Switzerland. He would not even tell his pilot he was guiding him there. Yossarian often thought of scheming with some pilot he trusted to fake a crippled engine and then destroy the evidence of deception with a belly landing, but the only pilot he really trusted was McWatt, who was happiest where he was and still got a big boot out of buzzing his plane over Yossarian's tent, or roaring in so low over the bathers at the beach that the fierce wind from his propellers slashed dark furrows in the water and whipped sheets of spray flapping back for seconds afterward. Dobbs and Hungry Joe were out of the question, and so was Orr, who was tinkering with the valve of the stove again when Yossarian limped despondently back into the tent after Dobbs had turned him down. The stove Orr was manufacturing out of an inverted metal drum stood in the middle of the smooth cement floor he had constructed. He was working sedulously on both knees. Yossarian tried paying no attention to him, and limped wearily to his cot and sat down with a labored, drawn-out grunt. Prickles of perspiration were turning chilly on his forehead. Dobbs had depressed him. Doc Danica depressed him. An ominous vision of doom depressed him when he looked at Orr. He began ticking with a variety of internal tremors. Nerves twitched, and the vein in one wrist began palpitating. Orr studied Yossarian over his shoulder, his moist lips drawn back around convex rows of large buck teeth. Reaching sideways, he dug a bottle of warm beer out of his footlocker, and he handed it to Yossarian after prying off the cap. Neither said a word. Yossarian sipped the bubbles off the top and tilted his head back. Orr watched him cunningly with a noiseless grin. Yossarian eyed Orr guardedly. Orr snickered with a slight, mucid sibilance and turned back to his work, squatting. Yossarian grew tense. "Don't start," he begged in a threatening voice, both hands tightening around his beer bottle. "Don't start working on your stove." Orr cackled quietly. "I'm almost finished." "No, you're not. You're about to begin. Here's the valve. See? It's almost all together. And you're about to take it apart. I know what you're doing, you bastard. I've seen you do it 300 times. Orr shivered with glee. "I want to get the leak in this gasoline line out," he explained. "I've got it down now to where it's only an ooze." "I can't watch you," Yossarian confessed tonelessly. "If you want to work with something big, that's okay, but that valve is filled with tiny parts, and I just haven't got the patience right now to watch you working so hard over things that are so goddamn small and unimportant. Just because they're small doesn't mean they're unimportant. I don't care. Once more, when I'm not around, you're a happy imbecile, and you don't know what it means to feel the way I do. Things happen to me when you work over small things that I can't even begin to explain. I find out that I can't stand you. I start to hate you. And I'm soon thinking seriously about busting this bottle down on your head or stabbing you in the neck with that hunting knife there. Do you understand?" Orr nodded very intelligently. "I won't take the valve apart now," he said, and began taking it apart, working with slow, tireless, interminable precision, his rustic, ungainly face bent very close to the floor, picking painstakingly at the minute mechanism in his fingers with such limitless, plodding concentration that he seemed scarcely to be thinking of it at all. Yossarian cursed him silently and made up his mind to ignore him. "What the hell's your hurry with that stove anyway?" he barked out a moment later in spite of himself. "It's still hot out. We're probably going swimming later. What are you worried about the cold for?" "The days are getting shorter," Orr observed philosophically. "I'd like to get this all finished for you while there's still time. You'll have the best stove in the squadron when I'm through. It will burn all night with this feed control I'm fixing, and these metal plates will radiate the heat all over the tent. If you leave a helmet full of water on this thing when you go to sleep, you'll have warm water to wash with, all ready for you when you wake up. Won't that be nice? If you want to cook eggs or soup, all you'll have to do is set the pot down here and turn the fire up." "What do you mean, me?" Yossarian wanted to know. "Where are you going to be?" Orr's stunted torso shook suddenly with a muffled spasm of amusement. "I don't know," he exclaimed, and a weird, wavering giggle gushed out suddenly through his chattering buck teeth like an exploding jet of emotion. He was still laughing when he continued, and his voice was clogged with saliva. "If they keep on shooting me down this way, I don't know where I'm going to be." Yossarian was moved. "Why don't you try to stop flying, Orr? You've got an excuse." I've only got 18 missions. But you've been shot down on almost every one. You're either ditching or crash landing every time you go up. Oh, I don't mind flying missions. I guess they're lots of fun. You ought to try flying a few with me when you're not flying lead, just for laughs. Orr gazed up at Yossarian through the corners of his eyes with a look of pointed mirth. Yossarian avoided his stare. They've got me flying lead again. When you're not flying lead. If you had any brains, do you know what you'd do? You'd go right to Pilchard and Wren and tell them you want to fly with me.